Number 179 is your reliquary figure. I never remember it as Nlo-Bieri, but you can write that down if you want to. I just call it the reliquary figure, created by the Fang people from southern Cameroon, 19th, 20th century, and this is wood. All right, so do we remember what a reliquary is? We have talked about another reliquary, the reliquary of Saint Foy, I believe from Romanesque, from the Church of Saint Foy. So remember, this is a sculpture that housed the bones of a martyr, or it's like the crown of thorns that Jesus would have worn. So it's like a relic, something important from these holy or sacred people, or it housed their bones. So a container holding body parts of someone who has died. But in our reliquary, the function, these figures were placed on top of these cylinder-like containers that were made of bark that held skulls and other bones of important clan leaders. But we should be able to relate these two together, right? They're both sitting, they both look very calm, and they are both reliquary figures, but had different functions. All right, there's our reliquary figure. And its contextual image minus Bernie. Sorry, I got that from somewhere. I couldn't help myself. So this is how they would have been used. Now we see them today in museums. So let's go look at one in a museum.
It guarded a reliquary. This figure is almost a talisman in that it was intended to ward off those that might harm the contents of that box, or as a warning to others who might come in contact with it and be harmed by it, like uninitiated men and women. So the contents of the box that this figure guarded were sacred and powerful. They were usually the bones of important members of society, important ancestors, along with potent substances like beads that they may have owned and medicine. So who constituted a great man for the Fang people? A very high status, noble person who had lived a long and good life. This would include lineage heads, clan heads, special warriors, even craftsmen who were exceptionally talented, as well as women who had borne lots of healthy children. It's believed that the Fang utilized these reliquary boxes with remains rather than putting them into a more permanent cemetery because they had been nomadic or semi-nomadic. They were probably maintained by elder men in the community who would be in charge of putting them together and consulting them when there was some great decision to be made. The figure has an elongated torso, a large rounded head.
All right, so make sure you guys write down elements of the form that they're talking about.
Eyes that look down, a closed mouth. The arms are clasped together, but there's a sense of very powerful musculature. So there's a balance between a figure that has a sense of calm and contemplativeness, and at the same time, real power and strength. It's almost as though the figure has this coiled up energy, this vitality that's ready to spring forth if it was needed.
Pause, hang on.
But otherwise retains a very calm, dignified appearance. The top of the head is enlarged. For the Fang, we saw.
Where have we talked about the head being enlarged before? It's kind of a common theme, right? The seat of wisdom. Smart.
See an emphasis on the head, particularly the coiffure, and the tubular nature of the limbs and the body. There's also an emphasis on the herniated belly button, which is, of course, where the umbilical cord first gives life to humans, just as this reliquary is guarding the remains of the deceased who have returned back into the spiritual world, waiting for rebirth. So this particular figure is a male figure, but the Fang also made reliquary guardian figures who were female. These figures also had a second life as puppets during young men's initiations. In other words, they were brought out to educate young men about their ancestors and help young men experience or be in the same place as the essence or the energy of their ancestors, who really were the founding fathers, the lineage heads of their ethnic group. While the face is very typically stylized, the hairstyle was popular when this object was actually made. So we have these three crests and kind of a ducktail in the back, which is what Fang men at the time, high status men, were wearing. When we look at so much African art, we're looking at art that is not naturalistic, and intentionally so. The purpose of the object was to express certain spiritual ideas. And so we see abstraction.
And guys, this is important because this is, again, why Picasso is going to fall in love with African art. It is not realistic. It's very idealized, and it's for these spiritual purposes, leading into abstraction.
We see eyes that are reduced to half circular shapes, and the cheeks forming these diagonal lines, and a kind of reduction to geometric shapes that art historians call abstraction. And we could also note that in the limbs, which are very cylindrical and rounded. The artist could have very easily depicted a naturalistic looking figure, but they chose abstraction. This is a conceptual piece. It's about the idea of a reliquary, the idea of this guardian figure, rather than depicting an actual human or how they look in nature, which was not of interest to this Fang artist. The wonderful tension in this figure is the fact that he is suggesting one approach.
Okay, let's do an overall, what we should have written down. All right, some overall takeaways that we should have written down. For form, these are considered abstract. They're not realistic. It's more about an idea. And then this also becomes an attraction for early 20th century artists like Picasso and Georges Braque, who we're going to learn about later. And overall, the form is composed of juxtaposing. That just means contrasting elements. So some of those juxtapositions that contrast each other, there's vertical and horizontal lines. So actually on your notes, I would like for you to draw all these vertical lines, right? It kind of enforces the elongation of the torso. And then you have the contrasting horizontal lines. All right, overall content, keeping opposite elements in balance. The form, like we just said, those opposing vertical and horizontal. The form of the figure reveals its function because it's about these juxtaposing or contrasting ideas. It's about birth versus death. Birth because of the belly button, the genitals, all that emphasize life. And then it sits on a barrel of bones, right? It's guarding the dead. Tranquility versus vitality. Infant, it has these little baby arms, but it's also supposed to reflect an ancestor. So it's all of these contrasting or juxtaposing ideas. So relating this to other artworks, we haven't talked about the Bundu mask on the right, but another African artwork that has a lot of emphasis on the forehead and then a very similar hairstyle. Also, you can easily relate this to the Nkisi Nkandi. These are both, relating to vessels. The Nkisi Nkandi, you put a substance into, whereas the reliquary figure sits on a vessel. These are both wood. They're both actually no, because that one's sitting on the right. One is supposed to look kind of intimidating and tranquil. The other one's supposed to be very aggressive. And then contrasting is their expressions. But then if you relate it to the Ndop, very similar expressions with being calm. They're both supposed to be an ideal representative of something, not look specifically like somebody. They're both seated. They're also both very shiny wood because they're both rubbed with oil. All right, that's it.